My first question would be to Kat, but also perhaps to Svenja, because somehow you were both talking about communication, but it seems to me that you are more talking about communication about aims external to the artwork, and Svenja was more talking about communication of aims internal to the artwork. Did I see that right? And isn't there the danger that you might instrumentalize an artwork for external aims?
So with my examples, I was trying to avoid that kind of instrumentalization. There is very much a danger of that. And that turns it into something different from an artwork in the end. I think that, personally, I think that certain forms of art lend themselves to communicating scientific ideas in a more cohesive manner than others. I think there's a difficulty, which is the kind of the niceties of scientific work are very hard to convey through art, and I'm not sure why we would really want to. But sometimes that's the case, and I don't know that really what comes out of that is generally the best work. But I think that there are instances where, I mean, artworks in and of themselves do communicate. They are a communication between the artist and the viewer. Yeah. And if that message is relating in some way to science, but not dictated by science, then I think that's perfectly valid. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I have a question for Svenja, because you showed us in the beginning of your nice talk the definition of bioart, that artists are considered as being a bioartist using tools and materials from the biosector or biotech sector for their artistic expressions. But what is your artistic expression, or what is the goal, the aim?
I think that my artwork, you'll see, is very fine arts orientated in a lot of instances, so I don't fit very comfortably in this idea of bioart. Some of my works are bioart works, so you could see the work that was the bioreactor chamber with the living cells would be classified as bioart, but a lot of my other works are very, very different. And I think that one of the key things that I try to engage with my work is a kind of joy of discovery and learning new things and thinking about the world differently. So that my intention is to allow people to have a glimpse into a different way of seeing the world. Hopefully that will be enriching in some way, even if it is just kind of going, wow, I never actually considered the origins of biomaterials, or how weird it is that you actually have cells that could fill, like the HeLa cell line, which could fill this whole entire building with cells. The fact that these are things that actually exist in the world, I think that that's really amazing. And these are sorts of part of the things that I want to share with people, but also complexity and multiplicity. So a lot of my works, those two works that I sort of showed from the beginning, all of my works, I generally exhibit at least 5 artworks that are all interconnected, but they tell different stories. So for me, it's not about presenting a singular viewpoint. So I hope that answers your question.
What about this question that is constantly put, I think, forward? Is this art or not? Is tinkering with life, playing around with cells, why should that be considered art?
It's interesting that a lot of people don't think, particularly things like, Oren and Yonat's work with the Tissue Culture and Art Project, that might not be art, when there are such really strong connections to conceptual art, and so to a whole range of kind of really well-established art historical practices. So I think that for them, they're using the aesthetics of the technology, but I think in a lot of ways they're drawing attention to the way in which the technologies that are employed in biosciences do have an aesthetic, and that you could regard it as you know, that they draw attention to all of these things, and I think they ask really important questions through the production of their work. So I think absolutely it is an artwork, because I think that for me, and I think it comes down as well to how do you define art, and I've had this conversation, it's a difficult one to answer, and so the way that I address that is always like, well, what is art to me? And to me personally, I don't think decorative items are art, because for me an artwork is a cultural product that has something to say, that is kind of a reflection of what's going on currently, so that it has kind of a level of criticality, but also that it has also a way of transforming. So that knowledge that it's imparting could also be experiential, so that you experience something that you would never experience before. And I think that Kat talking about this looking at infinity and getting that experience of infinity, for me that is art, because it gives you the experience of something that is new that you would never experience otherwise. So I think, yeah, I'm not sure if that really answers the question very much, but yes, I think it definitely is art.
Okay. Is there anyone who thinks that tinkering with life is not art? That you should not use, for instance, zebrafish embryos in an artwork?
I have a feeling that a lot of these kind of projects are not considered to be art, or are viewed with suspicion by the art world, because sometimes they don't come from a position that's informed by art as a discipline in itself. And I'd be interested to know what the panel think of that. Whether there's a kind of artistic naivety about some work, and engaging with science and scientific ideas, whether there's a gap opening up with the sort of idea of art as a discipline.
I think in the main, these projects are executed by people who have a strong sort of artistic background, and but I think that some projects like this some bioart projects are very challenging for people because of the kind of the issues that we all have had culturally portrayed to us of unnatural tinkering with life. That it's something that we generally, there's a cultural narrative about it and about being afraid of it, which I think goes some way to people criticising it as a discipline. I also think that there are times when projects like this can be aimed somewhat off the mark unintentionally, and I think that actually probably comes from a lack of time to synthesise the scientific methods that have been used into a coherent and a coherent conceptual idea by the artist. I think that's where the danger lies. And if there's too much direction being pushed it for perhaps communicative purposes, it can lead to a dissonance that is not favourable for the artwork or its reception within the artistic community.
Yeah.
Does it matter? Does it matter if the description of art is the way you describe it, or you? Isn't art just how we all experience it individually? And then when there is a commonality, art is coverable by everybody else.
But I also think that it's important to engage people into a dialogue about why, to think very carefully about what they consider to be art and why. And so I think, yes, it can be very personal, but I think it is also about thinking carefully about it and not, and again, like I'm sure that everyone here doesn't just say like, I don't know what art is, but I know what I like. And I think that that's sort of something that I would discourage, is this kind of, looking at things more from a very superficial and decorative level, rather than kind of really thinking about, well, what works are meaningful to me. And I think that that's what I personally think is, yes, everyone has their own opinion and has their likes and dislikes. or biases. But I think it's important to really think about,
Why would you consider that to be important?
Sorry? And again, that comes from my own biases, because as I said to you, what I consider to be art are things that are transformative, that are cultural products, and so that's where my bias lies. And so that there are certain artworks that I wouldn't really want to engage with because I might see them as being superficial, but they might still have really a lot of value, in particularly for the people's enjoyment and things like that, and they might kind of have values that lie outside of what I might consider to be, say, cultural. So it might be artworks that are really about providing a good time, that are more about an entertainment, and I don't think that they shouldn't exist, for example, but I think it's something that I personally, from my perspective, don't value as much.
I agree.
How do you know that your artworks go beyond this point of just being decorative?
Well, I guess I hope that they go beyond being decorative, but I have to say that I do use, and when you can see my work, I have a very deliberate, I'm supposed to use this.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
I have a very deliberate use of the fine arts aesthetic, and the reason that I use that is not because I think that is more to draw people in, because I know that people will be more interested to find out about my work if there is some sort of aesthetic sensibility to draw them towards the work. So I use a lot of deliberate things, and that's why even when I'm showing sort of works that are sort of very bioarts orientated, like bioreactors and things like that, I show them in conjunction with miniature landscapes, with other works that are like turtles with trees growing on their backs, with other things, so that it kind of creates all of these different connections. And so, but it is kind of about drawing people in first with the beauty of the object and then getting them to think. And I know that that's my strategy.
Well, I take it you're not a vegetarian.
I was at that point.
Okay. So basically you presented something that you wouldn't eat yourself.
Well, I had to eat it because the meat was like put in my freezer for a year, so I had to try it to make sure no one was going to get sick. So I had to eat the calves before I made the pies to make sure that they were still good.
So you're not a vegetarian anymore?
No.
Okay.
But I have to say, and one of the interesting things is that I get asked whether I'm a vegetarian all the time. And I have to say that initially when I was a vegetarian, it's a much more comfortable position to kind of occupy, particularly as a bioartist, because it's almost like gives you a sort of sense that you can kind of, that you have a higher position, because no, I don't actually use. But the reason that I've sort of stopped being a vegetarian is because I was also kind of going, well, what was my motivation at this point? Like, I was a vegetarian for a number of years, and I started off being a vegetarian partly because I didn't really like meat, and then I started thinking about animal ethics and all these sorts of things. But it had been such a long time that at the moment I'm going through a period of re-evaluation, because I'm kind of like, where do you sit when you actually use animal products on a daily basis in the laboratory that come from meat consumption? And, you know, why am I staying a vegetarian? And part of it, I think, and this is what I'm re-evaluating, is it because it's just an easier position to occupy because I can make work, but then go, but I am a vegetarian, and somehow that makes it easier to justify the use of animal products. Does that sort of, I don't know if that really makes sense.
No.
Did it make sense or not? Still, I'm a bit puzzled by your explanation, because it seems that you use this old school aesthetics to draw people in. Is that not kind of dumbing down?
No, but also to make links to, because a lot of my work uses museum style, a lot of my other work uses museum style elements. So I have glass chambers and things like that, and so it's also kind of making historical links with the way in which life science and things like that have been displayed previously. So part of it is a kind of drawing in that kind of aesthetic, but it also kind of has these links to other historical frameworks and frameworks of scientific display, of art display, of museum displays, and kind of trying to make links to a number of different things as well. And plus, I really like working in that way as well as an artist, so I tend to be someone that really enjoys making tiny, minute, complicated, visually aesthetic artworks as well. And that's part of my history, I suppose.
I think the theme for this evening is also about communication. No? So my question would be more the direction, and especially the dissemination but also not only dissemination, reception and appropriation. So I think dissemination is a very general word, and by presenting your art this evening, in a way you disseminate it among this audience, yet the audience is in some way an elite audience, presumably has some knowledge of biotechnologies, etc., etc. So at which point do you feel that it's important to address other target groups? And what would you say is the difference between dissemination in general and something targeted at form of reception? And what would be your idea about reception and appropriation? Because individuals can appropriate art, but also science communication in a different way. And if you want to really know something more about what you are addressing in your artworks, you do need a lot of websites where you can look into all kinds of techniques that have to do with biotechnology. I mean, it's not enough just to present your art. If someone's really interested and wants to know more, he has really a busy word day. So I'd just like to sort of have this a little bit in.
So, there's a lot of questions there. There's, if I take the other groups and then you can talk about the information that sits behind artworks, or shall I just?
I'm happy to talk as
Okay.
well.
So when it comes to access, I mean, in one sense, I would say that an artist isn't in charge of the accessibility of the work to different demographics. If I'm understanding the question correctly, then if an artwork is put out in the public sphere, it's hopefully it's available for anyone who is aware of its existence to go and see it if it's in a public space. And so then the question becomes more one of outreach, and that's a different sort of set of requirements than a practicing artist. When it comes to, so my work as a journalist, I generally, if I'm speaking, I speak to groups that have this kind of demographic, although culturally there are burgeoning festivals of ideas and, celebrations of knowledge in society, which are becoming increasingly open to everybody. And there are, as I was mentioning with Hackspaces and so on, there are these spaces that are available and accessible to everybody to go and start even, playing around with biomaterials if they want to. So I hope that answers the question if I understood it.
What can art add to this discussion that is not already in the public domain? Is that your question? Can art add something to the discussion, to all the information that is available that is not already somehow available there?
All right, well, from my perspective, I guess, I always kind of see my work as very much embedded into a range of other practices as well. So I write articles, I also do a lot of public talks like this one, which kind of allows me to kind of engage with people. But I also do it with primary school children, so I've worked with primary school children, high school children, first year students. So I've worked with a whole range of different educational institutes, but also kind of public forums at public art libraries and things like that. I run workshops that are kind of talking a bit about what's happening in the art, but then allowing the participants to have a little bit of engagement with contemporary biotechnologies or things like pretty simple things, so isolating DNA, things like that, bit of tissue, like plant tissue culture.
But then you are there to explain.
I am there to explain, but at exhibitions I'm generally there as well, and there'll always be kind of a night where you can come along and read the explanation.
But what does the artistic perspective add to that?
Well, I think that if you're going to view an artwork, I think it's often effective in a very different way than if you're viewing science.
But in what way?
In a kind
Try
of
to-
experiential way,
Yeah.
I think, and in a way that is more...
May I raise a question on that?
Yeah. Only raise the question, or
I would like to look at art from the perspective of cognition, of knowledge production. And of course you have different styles of knowledge production. You have science that gives explanations on nature, primarily in text. You have technology, which tries to gear nature to its aims, so there's another kind of craftsmanship. And then you have art, and that produces a different knowledge, probably, or like you say, in the realm of experience, of sensory disclosure of nature. Then my question is, what kind of knowledge do you produce in your works? Because what I see in your work on the cows or on Alice, of course there are questions raised about transgression, but the answer is, as far as I can see, is a lot of juggling with mystifying icons like skulls on butterfly wings and pigs with wings and angels. But what kind of knowledge is that? That seems just to be a quite normative or even moral stance that is transmitted, and not so much knowledge.
I guess that when I kind of look at my work, and I couldn't show all that many different works, but I think that one of the things that my work does in terms of, as a research project, was also kind of looking at an evolutionary mechanism of making. And it was connecting to a range of other ideas, but I think that a lot of my artworks are also about presenting a more ambiguous space as well, where it can kind of connect to a range of different emotional connections that biotechnologies inspire from a personal perspective. So I use a lot of sort of really obvious icons like the butterfly wings and the skulls and things like that, because I am really interested in trying to communicate to a public and to kind of use really publicly accessible visual imagery and things like that that will immediately kind of conjure associations within the minds of the viewer, so that they can actually start to understand some of the underlying ideas behind it. And I tie a lot of things like myths and symbols and things like that into my practice as well. And that's again a way of, for me, being able to communicate a little bit more easier with people that are viewing the work, I guess.
I'm just wondering why that communication has to be easy at all. You know, I would worry that you just reaffirm archetypes and end up kind of underestimating an audience. I guess that's kind of a comment, but yeah, I did have a question. Why should the communication be actually easy? That's something that never comes to my mind when I look at an artwork about it being actually, I don't even think about it in terms of communication. I personally don't think it is about that. The more I make work, the more I think that it is actually not really to do with communication. And,
so what is your work about, if it's not about a sense of communicating something? I think that, so what would it be? I'm just interested.
I think it's not about this thing of transferring my intentions to a person through an object. I mean, this amazing thing that artworks do is that, I don't know, okay, well, this is a terrible example. I make a sculpture of my mother's head and I put it on a plinth.
of your mother's?
My mother's head. It's a very bad example, but
okay.
it's what's coming with my head. And then title, sculpture of my mother's head. But the most important this thing does that it creates this duality of this is my mother's head, but it is this clay ball. So artworks are not just about this thing of communicating intent. There's something paradoxical and very difficult about the way they communicate, which is actually not communication. It's just the way we decide to talk about them, that they say something.
I think I can totally agree with what you're saying there as well, and I'm not saying that I want my viewpoint of what I intended my artworks from my perspective, that I want that to be the overarching message for everyone. But I'm also kind of, I am with a lot of things trying to communicate my particular viewpoint or my emotions at that time. And I do think that when you do look at the work, that some of the works are more easy to decipher and some works are much more complicated. And I chose kind of quite very simple kind of examples today, but I have produced a range of work where if you just had a look at the work, I don't think that you would necessarily get an immediate meaning, but you would still need to take time, and the meaning that you might gain from it might be different from what I might have intended. And I certainly don't want to create works, definitely not that have a kind of finality in terms of the meaning, because I don't think that that's possible anyway, to, you know, fix meaning like that down anyway in a creative work. So I am open to people having a different interpretation. But I guess for me, I do kind of make work a lot of the time with an audience in mind and a kind of experience that I would like to create for the people that are viewing it, or a particular idea that I might like to communicate. But it always is different depending on the work. So my intention with the skin jewellery project was very, very different to the absence of Alice in terms of what my outcomes were.
But again, that would be evocation of emotion, but what is the more or less content in terms of meaning of it?
Does that matter?
Yes, it does matter to me, yes.
As every individual experiences the meaning differently, it really doesn't matter. I mean,
There's a way that in that case art could evoke a discussion between participants. What kind of meaning is at stake? That would be a very
communication.
Yeah, it should stimulate this communication, but it can't stop at the station of merely evoking an emotion. That would be not enough, I guess.
Maybe merely is just the purpose. And
okay.
It's communication that is important.
There's a question here.
When I was following your explanations, because I was carefully looking at 20th century art history for the last couple of years, so do you really believe that the meaning is enclosed in the artwork, and using a kind of appropriate didactic visual language will somehow, in a magic process, communicate the meaning to the spectator? Because I guess in the 20th century, artists tried really hard to get rid of that myth.
Does an artwork have intrinsic characteristics that gives it a meaning?
I think, like I said, I think meaning is always kind of unhinged and unfixed, and it changes all the time, it changes over time. I think the meaning of the work changes as well for the artist in terms of how you understand an artwork when you first make it, and then later you might think of it very differently, and the meaning might change. And a lot of my works change all the time, so I might exhibit the same work under a different title, because the meaning for me changes, because of the context that it's displayed in also changes. So for me, I'm definitely not fixed in terms of the types of things that I might communicate, and a single work can communicate very different things depending on what I'm it to. So a lot of the time I do try to unhinge it from this kind of idea of fixity.
I highly enjoyed the presentation, so my question is, what makes it so interesting and unique about working with living organisms, and things like blood, hair, or heartbeat, or something? Like, science is so big, you can work with a lot of other materials like gravity, metals, and stuff. What makes it so interesting? What makes bioart so interesting compared to other arts who work with other types of material or scientific knowledge?
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I do think bioart is particularly kind of viscerally challenging to us. I personally don't work in bioart at all, and my own practices in environmental with an environmental persuasion. So yeah, I think that the amazing thing about bioart, which really has captured everyone's imagination tonight, in fact, is the fact that it ultimately questions life and identity. But I'm going to pass over to you if you would like to say anything.
I think that I've sort of spoken about why my motivations.
So there we go, that's my thoughts on it then.
Okay, then we go to the last final question. No.
What is the role of the living in your artwork?
I think the role of the living, that's a strange question, because I think that my work deals a lot with living and death, and then things kind of living again, and sort of these boundaries that are continually shifting in response to biotechnologies. So, yeah, so I think that for me, the role of the living, I don't always work with living organisms, and I guess for me it's more about exploring boundaries and the way in which they're shifting.
So it's a metaphor in your, it's used as another metaphor in your artwork, or is it used as, what is the importance? Is it just a metaphor, or is there something more?
Well, I think that for me, because I work with cells and tissue, so I work with living things as well, and so for me, yes, it functions sometimes on a metaphorical level when I'm using things like the silkworm cocoon scaffold and then seeding cells into it, so because I'm making a link to the idea of transformation and things like that. So it does kind of have a metaphorical meaning with a lot of my work, but then it is actually living cells that have been reanimated from dead organisms, where in a way they've kind of had this inward-verse movement where they've gone from an animal and a multicellular organism into an individual single-celled organism in a flask with multiple kind of other ones. So it's, for me, also about transformation. And I don't know, like I said, I think that a lot of the way that I work with organisms and things is coming from very much a sense of a joy of discovery and engaging with a range of different organisms.
Okay, I guess it's now time to wrap up. And to indulge in some heavy drinking in the bar over there. I thank you all very much for being here, and most of all, of course, I thank Kat and Svenja for the beautiful talks, and well, let's give them a big applause.